Terrible Swift Sword. The Life of General Philip Sheridan. By Joseph Wheelan. Narrated by R.C. Bray. Copyright 2012 by Joseph Wheelan. This unabridged audiobook is published by arrangement with Da Capo Press, a member of the Perseus Books Group, and was produced in the year 2013 by Tantor Media Incorporated, which holds the copyright thereto. They want war too methodical, too measured. I would make it brisk, bold, impetuous, perhaps sometimes even audacious. Antoine-Henri Jomini. Prologue. October 19th, 1864. Winchester, Virginia. Major General Philip Sheridan and his 300-man escort rumbled through the streets of the oft-captured strategic crossroads city in the early morning. All around them, the Shenandoah Valley was ablaze with vivid autumnal yellows and reds under a serene blue sky. It might have been a glorious day for picnicking, except for the disturbing sound of distant cannon fire. After an absence of 3 days, Sheridan was returning to his army of the Shenandoah. His 32,000 veterans were camped to the south among an accordion-like series of ridges along the north bank of Cedar Creek. On the creek's other bank, Massanutten Mountain, and significantly Three Top Mountain with its Confederate signal station, loomed over the Union encampment. Sheridan had been in Washington to confer with War Secretary Edwin Stanton and Army Chief of Staff Henry Halleck about his army's next move. They liked his plan to send most of his men to General Ulysses S. Grant at Petersburg, leaving just a small force at the valley's north end to check any rebel advances. Major fighting in the valley seemed at an end. In September, Sheridan's army had defeated Lieutenant General Jubal Early's army of the valley at the Third Battle of Winchester, and then, 3 days later, had driven the rebel forces from Fisher's Hill. The Confederates had drawn within 70 miles to the south, to Waynesboro. But then, on October 12th, Early's army had suddenly reappeared at Strasburg, just a few miles south of the Yankee positions. Sheridan had already sent the Sixth Corps marching east to join Grant. He ordered it to return. On October 16th, Union signalmen intercepted a rebel communication indicating that Lieutenant General James Longstreet's First Corps was marching to Early's aid. A courier had overtaken Sheridan on his way to Washington. After reading the message and obtaining intelligence on recent enemy movements, Sheridan concluded that it was a red herring. It was. But he was unable to rid himself of nagging second thoughts, and he had returned as quickly as possible. When Sheridan left his army, the rebels occupied Fisher's Hill, about 10 miles south of Cedar Creek. But today, the rebels were no longer at Fisher's Hill. Like many Civil War generals, Sheridan had risen fast after being stuck in rank at lieutenant for 8 years in the peacetime army. He was still just a captain in 1862 when he was given his first field command, the 2nd Michigan Cavalry in Mississippi. His career had taken off with a series of battlefield promotions. He was now responsible for parts of 3 infantry corps and the Cavalry Corps. In December 1862 at Stones River, Sheridan's division had slowed the Confederate onslaught long enough to save Major General William Rosecrans's Army of the Cumberland from destruction. In 1863, his division had reached the crest of Missionary Ridge first and pursued Braxton Bragg's retreating army the longest. In May 1864, Sheridan's Cavalry Corps had defeated the rebel cavalry at Yellow Tavern and mortally wounded the celebrated Jeb Stuart. When Jubal Early threatened Washington in July 1864, President Abraham Lincoln, General Ulysses Grant, and War Secretary Edwin Stanton decided that the Shenandoah Valley had to be cleared of rebel armies. They combined 4 military departments and made Sheridan commander of some of the best fighting men in the Union Army. Sheridan had impressed Grant at Missionary Ridge, and later, too, when he transformed the Cavalry Corps into a mobile strike force. He was increasingly seen as a man who got things done fast, a man who could think on his feet. He was small, 5'5" at most, and thin but wiry and broad-shouldered. His men called him Little Phil. On horseback, Sheridan appeared larger because his torso and arms were disproportionately long and his legs were short. He possessed incredible stamina that enabled him to function at a high level without sleep or food. For a man of slight stature, Sheridan's appearance was striking. With his heavy arched brows, piercing Tartar-like hazel eyes, chin beard, and curling mustache, he bore a strong resemblance to a Mongolian horse soldier. He kept his hair cropped short because he hated his curls. Someone once observed that his hair looked painted on. A Southern civilian declared Sheridan the most savage-looking man he had ever seen, but then related a kindness that Sheridan had shown him. In the Shenandoah Valley, Sheridan became a favorite of Lincoln and Grant, not only because he struck hard and won battles, but also because he believed, as they did, in ruthlessly waging a total war on all of the Confederacy's resources. They, along with Major General William Tecumseh Sherman, believed that destroying the enemy's army, burning his farms, killing his livestock, hanging his guerrillas, and freeing his slaves would win the war quicker and save lives. As he strode through Winchester's streets on Rienzi, his big war-horse, 17 hands high or nearly 6 feet at the withers, Sheridan noticed that townswomen were standing in the windows and doors, shaking their skirts at us and otherwise markedly insolent in their demeanor. Initially he thought nothing of their behavior. But when the sound of artillery fire grew louder at the edge of town, he began to wonder whether the women had been in raptures over some good news, while I as yet was utterly ignorant of the actual situation. He knew that a 19th Corps detachment was conducting a reconnaissance that morning, but the gunfire seemed to suggest a large-scale engagement, not a skirmish. Sheridan was correct in surmising that the rebel women knew something that he did not. Mrs. Hugh H. Lee wrote in her diary that earlier that morning, the glorious news that Early had routed 2/3 of Sheridan's army had reached Winchester. After riding a short distance farther, Sheridan leaned forward and listened intently, wrote Major George A. Sandy Forsyth, an aide. He was trying to locate and interpret the gunfire. Then he dismounted and placed his ear near the ground, seeming somewhat disconcerted as he rose again and remounted. Alarming signs began to appear as they traveled south on the Valley Turnpike. A supply train bound for the front lines was stopped in the road, seemingly in great confusion. Sheridan sent Forsyth ahead to find out what was wrong. The quartermaster told Forsyth that an officer from the front had warned him to turn back. The army had been attacked and was being driven down the valley. From the crest of the next ridge, everything became shockingly evident. Spread before them was the appalling spectacle of a panic-stricken army. Sheridan ordered most of his escort to remain on the ridge. He sent instructions to Colonel Oliver Edwards, who commanded a 6th Corps brigade in Winchester, to deploy a straggler line across the Valley Turnpike to stop fleeing soldiers, yet to allow wagons to pass through so they could park north of town. Then, with Major Forsyth, Captain Joseph O'Keefe, and a dozen troopers, Sheridan rode on at a fast trot, gray dust rising in a plume in their wake. They met a flood of men and wagons headed toward the rear, and soldiers who had stopped beside the road to brew coffee. Sheridan shouted to them, "Turn back, men! Turn back! Face the other way!" When the soldiers saw the towering charger, bearing the familiar fierce-featured man in the flat-brimmed hat, an echoing cheer arose. "God damn you! Don't cheer me!" Sheridan shouted at them. "If you love your country, come up to the front. God damn you! Don't cheer me! There's lots of fight in you men yet. Come up! God damn you, come up!" Wild enthusiasm traveled from regiment to regiment along the Valley Pike. Flags were waving. Men were throwing their hats high in the air, shouting for joy, for now we had a leader, wrote Frank Flynn of the 38th Massachusetts Infantry. We knew now that there was to be no more retreat. The men began chanting, "Sheridan, Sheridan." They swung their hats in glee, and by the hundreds, and then the thousands, they began to follow him back to the front. Forsyth was astonished by the effect that Sheridan had on the men. It is no exaggeration to say that as he dashed onto the field of battle, for miles back the turnpike was lined with men pressing forward after him to the front. Sheridan was going to attempt what no commander had ever done during the war, to lead an army beaten in battle to victory on the same day. In Sheridan Circle in Washington, D.C. stands the iconic equestrian statue of Phil Sheridan, green with age. Reaching backward with his hat in hand, Sheridan rallies his men at Cedar Creek. He and Rienzi are action incarnate, captured in medias res. The sculpture accurately depicts a man who led from the front and believed it was almost always best to take the offensive. Phil Sheridan's legacy, of course, is richer and more complex than a statue representing him at a climactic moment can convey. Cedar Creek was only one point along an ascending line that ended with Sheridan becoming the Union commander most responsible for bringing Robert E. Lee to bay, as well as Grant's most trusted troubleshooter. At the war's conclusion, Grant, Sherman, and Sheridan were recognized as the Union's victorious triumvirate, forever linked by their invaluable collaboration in defeating the Confederacy. Supremely confident that Sheridan could rise to any challenge, Grant gave him a broad spectrum of post-war assignments that tested and stretched his abilities. They ranged from governing defiant Louisiana and Texas to waging the nation's first Cold War to subduing the Plains Indians. In suppressing the Indians, Sheridan conceived the idea of striking their winter camps, a ruthless strategy that succeeded brilliantly. When Grant became president in 1869, he pulled Sherman and Sheridan up with him, with Sherman becoming general of the Army and Sheridan taking Sherman's old position as commander of the Division of the Missouri. The three remained close friends and allies until the end of their days. Sheridan succeeded Sherman upon his retirement. Scores of biographies have been written about Grant and dozens about Sherman, but Sheridan has remained somewhat of an enigma, the reason being that all of his diaries, journals, personal papers, and documents were destroyed in the Great Chicago Fire of 1871. With his source material gone, Sheridan had difficulty writing his personal memoirs, and it is no wonder that biographers have struggled too. The inner man remains indistinct, although his letters and reports, as well as the accounts of contemporaries, provide glimpses of him. One thread running through Sheridan's life was his readiness to defend what he believed needed protecting, utilizing every available resource. After fighting to save the Union, he defended black freedmen against ex-rebels in Texas and Louisiana, settlers against pillaging Indians, reservation Indians against corrupt agents and contractors, and Yellowstone National Park against vandals, poachers, and corporate exploiters. He believed ends justified practically any means, no matter how harsh. In Virginia's Shenandoah Valley, Sheridan's name will always be associated with the burning, his systematic destruction of Virginia's breadbasket. In some parts of the West, his name evokes images of bloody daybreak attacks on Indian villages in wintertime. However, his friends and comrades Grant and Sherman believed there was no better military leader than Sheridan. In 1876, then-President Grant spoke to Representative George F. Hoar of Massachusetts with unusual feeling on the subject. "I believe General Sheridan has no superior as a general, either living or dead, and perhaps not an equal. People think he is only capable of leading an army in battle, or to do a particular thing when he is told to." According to the president, however, those people were wrong. Sheridan was capable of directing as large a territory as any two nations can cover in a war. Chapter 1. Rise from Obscurity, 1831 to 1862. He is worth his weight in gold. He would not make a stampeding general. Three generals recommending Phil Sheridan's promotion to brigadier general in July 1862. Philip Henry Sheridan's birthplace is a rare opacity in an otherwise transparent life spent largely in uniform. 4 versions exist. In his personal memoirs, Sheridan states that he was born in Albany, New York on March 6, 1831, fittingly the month of Mars, the Roman god of war. Somerset, Ohio, the village where he grew up, claims Sheridan as a native son. Strangely, no written record of Sheridan's birth exists in either place. Sheridan's mother once said that Philip was born at sea during the family's migration from Ireland to America, but in 1888 she insisted that his birthplace was Somerset and named the priest who had baptized him. Others have asserted that he was born in County Cavan, Ireland, A stone marker in front of a stone house in Killincare reportedly commemorates the event. Not in dispute is that Sheridan's father, John Sheridan, was a county Cavan tenant farmer who claimed lineage from Irish kings and married his second cousin Mary Meenagh. Together, they worked John Sheridan's lease holding on the Cherrymount estate near Killincare in north-central Ireland. In 1831, the family immigrated to America at the urging of John Sheridan's uncle, Thomas Gaynor, an émigré who lived in Albany. The Sheridans loaded a horse cart with their worldly possessions, and a neighbor drove them to Dublin. Historian Eric Wittenberg writes that the neighbor reported that Mary Sheridan held young Philip in her arms. In Dublin, the Sheridans booked passage on a ferry to Liverpool, where they boarded a packet ship to America with their two older children, Patrick and Rosa, and possibly Phil, too. Rosa died during the ocean voyage and was buried at sea. Some historians have suggested that Sheridan pointedly claimed Albany as his birthplace because he entertained presidential ambitions, and being foreign-born would have made him ineligible. But this seems far-fetched, because Sheridan never evinced the slightest interest in seeking any elective office. More plausibly, if Sheridan did lie about his origins, he probably was trying to distance himself from the Irish immigrants swamping Boston and New York in the wake of the potato famine, just as Sheridan was matriculating at West Point in 1848. Between 1847 and 1854, the arrival of 1.2 million Irish, at least one-sixth of Ireland's population, aroused widespread xenophobia and helped inspire the rise of the nativist Know-Nothing Party. Albany may have been Sheridan's self-inoculation against the intense hostility toward Irish immigrants. John Sheridan did not linger in Albany. Lured by the prospect of steady work, he moved on to Somerset, a village of 1,400, southeast of Columbus, Ohio. He got a job building the National Road, a federal project to link the Potomac and Mississippi rivers. Later, he became an independent contractor for the National Road, the Hocking Valley Canal, and the Zanesville and Maysville Turnpike in Ohio. Because John Sheridan's work often kept him away from home, Mary Sheridan raised Phil, his three brothers, and his surviving sister. Mrs. Sheridan was a devout Catholic in a village that was overwhelmingly Catholic because of its large Irish immigrant population. A small boy with long arms and a bullet-shaped head, Sheridan belonged to the West Side Pigfoots, one of Somerset's two warring factions of boys, the other being the East Side Turkeyfoots, and was a respected street fighter, although not a boy who started fights. He and his friend Henry Greiner liked to play hooky and go fishing and swimming. In 1840, Colonel Richard M. Johnson of Kentucky campaigned in Somerset while challenging President Martin Van Buren for the Democratic nomination. Most of Somerset's Democrats turned out to meet Johnson, the man reputed to have killed Shawnee Indian Chief Tecumseh at the Battle of the Thames in 1813. Sheridan and some other boys who claimed Whig affiliation hung back, but when Johnson approached to shake their hands, the boys shoved Sheridan to the front of the crowd. When Johnson offered his hand, Sheridan refused to shake it. Johnson asked him why. "Because I am a Whig," Sheridan replied. Johnson said that it didn't matter, but Sheridan would not relent. Finally, Johnson, laughing along with the crowd, said, "Boys, give way and let the little Whig out. We can't force or coax him to shake hands with a Democrat." When he was 14, Sheridan left school and took a job at John Talbot's grocery and hardware store for $24 a year. After 1 year, Sheridan quit Talbot, known as a humorless skinflint, to work in David Whitehead's store for $60. A few months later, Sheridan again changed jobs, going to Fink and Ditto Dry Goods for $24 a year. As head clerk and then bookkeeper, Sheridan displayed an aptitude for creating order and keeping track of things. Sheridan first considered a military career during the Mexican War after reading newspaper reports about the exploits of a local volunteer company, the Keokuk Rifles. The boys who were too young to enlist formed their own unit, the Kosciuszko Braves. They wore green uniforms, gaudily trimmed in plaid, and turbans with black plumes. The uniforms and the battle accounts ignited Sheridan's new ambition to attend the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. A cadet was often seen in Somerset courting a girl attending St. Mary's Female Academy, and Sheridan and Griner enjoyed spying on them. The cadet was William Tecumseh Sherman, and the girl was his future wife, Ellen Ewing. At Fink and Ditto's, Sheridan became acquainted with Congressman Thomas Ritchie, who sometimes handed out apples from his orchard to the store employees. Sheridan asked Ritchie to secure an appointment for him at West Point. Ritchie had already selected another boy, but when that boy failed his entrance examination, Ritchie recommended Sheridan in his place. After a few months of intensive studying and tutoring by the local schoolmaster, Sheridan boarded a train to West Point. He easily passed the entrance exam and was admitted to the Corps of Cadets on July 1, 1848. West Point's influence was becoming strongly felt throughout the U.S. Army. Established under a law signed by President Thomas Jefferson nearly 50 years earlier, it was modeled upon France's L'École Polytechnique. West Point was not only the Army's institution of higher learning, but also its proving ground for tactics and new weapons and war materials, such as cast-iron gun carriages, pontoon bridges, and breech-loading pistols. During the Civil War, nearly 450 West Point graduates served as Union or Confederate generals. Sheridan found the coursework challenging, but he was fortunate in his assigned roommate, Henry W. Slocum. A former schoolteacher, Slocum would later serve as a Union Corps commander at Gettysburg and during Sherman's march through Georgia. After taps at 10 p.m., Slocum draped a blanket over their window, and by candlelight or whale oil lamp, tutored Sheridan in algebra and other subjects with which he struggled. In an attempt to compensate for his uneven academic background, Sheridan read widely during the weekends, when cadets were permitted to use the Academy Library for recreational reading. The records show that, among other items, he withdrew 4 books on Napoleon and his campaigns, biographies of Samuel Johnson, Lord Byron, and Mohammed, works on the geography of Ireland, Greenland, California, and Oregon, and Sir Walter Scott's Waverley novels. Antebellum West Point had an unofficial caste system. At its pinnacle were the Southern Episcopalians, with Virginians occupying the very top echelon. Sheridan and the other Irish-American Catholics from the North ranked far down in the pecking order, an arrangement that was amenable to those on top and resented by those who were not. On the West Point parade ground one day in September 1851, at the beginning of Sheridan's 4th year, a sergeant cadet from Virginia, William Terrell, peremptorily ordered him to dress or step closer to the man beside him. Sheridan, who believed that he was already properly closed up, snapped. Crying, "God damn you, sir, I'll run you through," he charged Terrell with his bayonet lowered. Before Sheridan could make good this threat, however, a dawning awareness of what he was about to do caused him to stop and return to the ranks, where he continued to berate and menace Terrell. Terrell rightly put Sheridan on report, which only stoked Sheridan's anger further, precipitating an explosion the next day when Sheridan encountered Terrell on the barracks steps. With a curse, Sheridan clouted Terrell in the head. Terrell fought back. The larger Virginian had the upper hand over the former Pigfoot scrapper when an officer separated them. After the cadets submitted their respective explanations for the altercation, Sheridan, who admitted to starting the fight, was suspended from West Point for 1 year. In choosing to suspend rather than expel Sheridan, which he would have been justified in doing, Superintendent Henry Brewerton taught Sheridan a lesson in self-control that he took to heart during the long months that he spent in Somerset working at his old job of keeping the books at Fink and Ditto's. Sheridan returned to West Point during the summer of 1852 to complete his senior year. His former classmates, who included Slocum, another ex-roommate George Crook, and Alexander McCook, Sheridan's future corps commander, had graduated and left for their first postings as commissioned officers. Sheridan joined the 1853 class of James McPherson, John Bell Hood, John Schofield, and Terrell, his nemesis. His new roommate was Joshua Sill, and Robert E. Lee was the new superintendent. Sheridan was not an exemplary cadet. He graduated in the bottom third of his class with plenty of demerits, but one important lesson stuck with him down the years, an abiding belief in offensive warfare. It was the central lesson of Dennis Hart Mahan's 6-lesson Science of War seminar, a springtime pre-graduation rite for West Point first-classmen. Mahan, toting the iconic umbrella that he carried in all weathers, spent his entire teaching career at West Point. The cadets nicknamed him Old Common Sense because he emphasized common sense and suffered from a chronic nasal infection. Mahan's senior year class in civil engineering, draftsmanship, military engineering, and the building of permanent and field fortifications was the capstone of a cadet's academic career. West Point was essentially an engineering school whose top graduates went into the Corps of Engineers, while those in the bottom tier became infantry officers. In his warfare seminar, Mahan, a devotee of Napoleon and French military theorist Antoine Jomini, literally shaped the antebellum graduates' tactical and strategic military philosophy. A leader, he said, should make it his object to destroy the enemy's army, and not simply to capture territory. Furthermore, he wrote, war must be carried into the enemy's homeland to make the civilian population suffer, the very definition of total war. Always concentrate one's forces and attack the enemy's flanks, Mahan counseled, and then relentlessly pursue him when he is beaten. Successful warfare is almost always offensive warfare, Mahan wrote in his slender booklet with a long title, Elementary Treatise on Advanced Guard, Outpost, and Detachment Service of Troops, and the Manner of Posting and Handling Them in the Presence of the Enemy. During the coming conflagration, Mahan's 6 lessons would become integral to the battle plans of both sides, and his booklet would occupy a place in the saddlebags of both Union and Confederate officers. Having graduated in the bottom third of his class, Brevet Second Lieutenant Sheridan did not bother to apply for assignment to a particular branch of the Army. He knew he was unlikely to get it. He was sent to the 1st U.S. Infantry at Fort Duncan, Texas, on the Rio Grande. It was a relief to put West Point behind him and to be looking forward with pleasant anticipation to the life before me. Sheridan reached western Texas in March 1854. On his 200-mile overland journey from Corpus Christi to Fort Duncan, he marveled at the big, open country and its abundant wildlife. In Laredo, he rode out a blue norther, heavy rains followed by 3 days of strong northerly winds and piercing cold. Because of recent Comanche and Lipan raids, Sheridan was sent to Camp La Pena, 60 miles east of Fort Duncan, for scouting duty with Company D of the 1st Infantry. Throughout the spring and summer, he was on the move almost continually, tracking and chasing small bands of Indians without ever engaging in direct combat. He made maps, learned some Spanish from the Mexican guide, and trapped and studied the bright-colored birds whose migrations brought them through the Rio Grande Valley. He learned to stalk, kill, butcher, and dress game. He and his hunting companion kept Sheridan's company supplied with meat. One of Sheridan's duties as company subaltern was to ensure that each morning the soldiers drank their ration of pulque. Pressed from the maguey plant and left to ferment in bottles, it was repulsive, vile-tasting, and sulphurous-smelling. But it inoculated the troops against scurvy in a place where fresh vegetables and fruit were rare. Sheridan learned to gulp it down as quickly as possible. The soldiers went into winter quarters at Fort Duncan. Sheridan and the other young officers passed many pleasant evenings attending dances across the Rio Grande and Piedras Negras at the home of the Mexican commandant. The commandant's family invited the town's upper-class young women to dance with the American officers. Light refreshments were served, and the occasions, wrote Sheridan, were marked by the greatest decorum. In November 1854, Sheridan was promoted to 2nd lieutenant without the brevet, or provisional, designation, and was transferred to the 4th U.S. Infantry in California. The following spring he left for Fort Reading. March 26, 1856, Washington Territory. At the bustling Fort Vancouver dock, 2nd Lieutenant Phil Sheridan and his 40 dragoons, with a small iron naval cannon in tow, were poised to board the steamer Belle and sail up the Columbia River to rescue white settlers barricaded in the Middle Cascades blockhouse. Hundreds of U.S. Army regulars were urgently collecting food, weapons, and clothing as steamers stood ready to take them upriver. It was reminiscent of Fort Vancouver's heyday, back when it was an important Hudson's Bay Company trading center for the...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?